Welcome everyone to today's book talk. My name is Nadia Ali and I'm the current director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown, where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. I'm very happy to be in conversation today with Professor Sherine Hafez to discuss her book. I'm showing you a copy here, Women of the Midan, the Untold Stories of Egypt's Revolutionaries. This talk is co-sponsored by the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, AMEWS, and also by the joint project and network 10 Years on Mass Protests and Uprisings in the Arab World. I'm very glad that today's event will be translated simultaneously into Arabic. But unfortunately, there's a little technical glitch, so you'll have to go into the channel that says German, but you will be able to listen in Arabic. As many of you are already aware, have followed some of our events, I'm trying to focus during my time directing the center on the centrality of gender as a lens to try to understand broader political developments in the Middle East, in North Africa and its diasporas. And I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague, Professor Sherine Hafez, whose research and publications for many years have contributed greatly to this aim, the aim to take a feminist lens, a gender lens, and understand broader political developments. So let me introduce Professor Hafez, Sherine, to you. Welcome, Sherine.
Welcome, Nadia, and I want to start by thanking you for this generous invitation. I want to thank Barbara Uber-Kurter for putting up with all of the details of putting this event on. I also want to thank the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University, as well as the Association of Middle East Women's Studies for this invitation. Thank you.
Great. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. So Sherine is professor and department chair of gender and sexuality studies at UC Riverside. She is the co-editor of the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, AMEWS, and also served as the president of the Association of Middle East Anthropologists. Sherine's research focuses on Islamic movements and gender studies in Arab and Middle Eastern cultures. She is the author of The Terms of Empowerment, Islamic Women's Activism in Egypt, which was published in 2003, which questioned the applicability of Western liberal conceptions of empowerment to Islamic women's activism. Her second book, An Islam of Her Own, Reconsidering Religion and Secularism in Women's Islamic Movements, was published in 2011. And this book, and many of us have both of the books on our reading list, but this book challenges binary representations of women's subjectivities in Islamic movements by relating the interplay between the complex debates of modernity and post-coloniality to the particular historicity of Islam and secularism. Sherine co-edited Anthropology of the Middle East and North Africa into the New Millennium in 2013, and her articles appear in many journals. I'm not going to mention them all, but today, of course, we're discussing her most recent book. So Sherine, I read your book over the summer as part of the AMEWS Book Award, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm so glad that we can talk about it. And one of the things that really struck me in your book is that it's trying to make the argument, and it's making the argument convincingly, that women's bodies are very central to processes of citizenship making in the context of the uprisings in the region. And you focus specifically on Egypt to illustrate how in Egypt the gendered body, became a signifying agent of collective action and transformation. So can you elaborate on this argument and the way you develop it throughout the book?
Thank you. So the book is really based on the premise that social political change is possible through the reconstitution of the body outside the norm. What we all saw in Tahrir, I think many of the observers also noted how the mass of bodies in Tahrir transformed the space. What I argue in the book, that it's not simply that the space was transformed, that the social order was also transformed through the corporeal occupation of space. So when we focus on women, and women were a very large percentage of the protesters in Tahrir, at least in the first 18 days, following the explosion of revolution in Tahrir, women had to deal with various intersections that were imposed on their bodies and their political participation far more than what men had to deal with. So when we looked at the intersection of all of these restrictions on women's participation, it became clear to me that there was a political intervention that was happening here through their corporeal representation in Tahrir. And I believe in my heart that that kind of transformation will continue to happen, despite the fact that many people argue that the uprising failed.
Sorry, yes. So I'm actually interested to follow up on that. So a couple of weeks ago, I was invited with our colleague Frances Hasso to speak at an event on crowds and the Arab uprisings at NYU. And we were reflecting on this question of gender in crowds. And so my take on this was the kind of the precarity of crowds and the ambivalence that as a woman you feel in a crowd. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that, because there were the 18 days where when we speak, I don't know if you were there, but everyone who was there, my friends, it's like speaking about these 18 days when they felt safe and they didn't feel harassed, and some even say, oh, they felt that the suspension of gender norms almost, right? Mm-hmm. But then a few weeks later, and I'm thinking about this particularly because, of course, next Monday we have International Women's Day. Mm-hmm. When a group of women then went to demonstrate, to mark International Women's Day and to demand their rights, there was a very different reaction. I mean, they were attacked, they were told to go home. So what is sort of your take on that, and how, the sort of transformation of, bodies and specific context?
That's a very good question. And I actually talk about Women's International Day. And I feel that despite the shock that many of the women experienced in Tahrir, because of the heckling and the harassment that they experience due to the appearance of these random groups in Tahrir, I think that moment was a pivotal moment in women's participation in Tahrir. Not only because it exposed the underbelly of state intervention and the various groups that were basically invested in curtailing the development of the uprising, but also because it galvanized women in a way that was unprecedented. So the next few days, there was the march, Egypt's women are a red line. And that actually saw an incredible feminist uprising within the larger uprising of the revolution in Tahrir. So I feel that as events developed, the resistance also negotiated and developed with it. Women are not new to negotiation vis-a-vis power. And I actually witnessed these events with, not just with alarm, obviously we were all alarmed and we didn't know where this was going, but I also witnessed these events with great excitement, because what you were seeing was the galvanization and development and mobilization of women's feminist consciousness in a way that, was rarely seen in Egyptian history. So, I mean, this is not new, as the book argues. Also, I show, the history of women's corporeal participation and women's intervention. This was not new, despite the fact that the media was representing this as unprecedented and the awakening of women, et cetera, et cetera. This had a long history behind it, and that history intersected with that particular moment to push things forward in a way that was truly new and truly inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of us were really frustrated by the way that women's mobilization was represented in the media. I mean, not only in Egypt, but sort of this idea, oh, see, you know, women are for the first time actually participating. And I think, you know, many of us felt compelled to remind everyone, no, I mean, there are long histories of women's political participation. I mean, if you think about Egypt, you know, at the turn of the 20th century, you had a large scale mobilization. You had women protesting against British colonialism. You had the Egyptian Feminist Union emerging in the 20s and 30s at a scale where in many Western contexts, you know, women could only dream to have the kind of mobilization. So, and I like in your book that you have, you know, a chapter in which you actually historicize and show that, yes, there are certain developments, there are certain ruptures, there are certain forms of mobilization, and certainly in terms of the scale of women's mobilization, but there's a history to it.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
That was actually one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I mean, it was so important to me. I felt so, frustrated at the way that the media was representing this. And I realized early on that this is going to be framed in a way that was not going to be conducive to women. And I was right, because eventually the state also intervened in the way that women's participation in Tahrir was framed. State media also framed many of the events, and specifically gender relations in Tahrir, in ways that undermined the revolution and discredited the uprising. So it was very important for me to do this, especially because as my conversations with the women developed, many of them started forgetting. And I can't tell you how many times when I had conversations with women, they would start by saying, "You're making me remember." Right, and so that also, created like an impetus for me to put this together in a way that can keep it at least from being reframed, or at least to point out the issues that are at stake so that people can be aware of how these events can be reframed.
Yes. Just for the audience, you can use the Q&A function if you would like to ask a question, excuse me, or make a comment. And also a reminder that Arabic translation is available through the German channel. So I also, I'm thinking about, because I've been talking and thinking a lot over the last few years as we are commemorating, of course, the 10 years of uprisings in the region. And one of the things that I've been arguing, and very much, of course, also informed by your book and also my work in Iraq and Lebanon and so on, is this concept of body politics. Mm-hmm. And the way that, body politics has been so central to the various uprisings. And I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on that, both in the way that it has played out specifically in the Egyptian context, but also more broadly. I'm sure you have sort of looked a little bit sort of comparatively.
So obviously body politics are at the center of what was happening. I mean, we're looking at corporeal descent in a country that is not politically, that is not conducive for political freedom. Let's just put it that way. So biopolitics, for example, as defined by Foucault, as explained by Foucault, reflects the regulation of populations through biopower. What was witnessed also in Tahrir was a bigger extension of biopolitics. It was not simply the regulation of populations through biopower. It was also the sort of emphasis on the physical and punishable potential of the state on the bodies in Tahrir. And the higher the punishment, the more vicious and violent it was, and the more random it was, the more it underscored the power of the state and sovereignty itself. So from biopolitics, it became clear to me that this is just not business as usual, which, by the way, biopolitics is very essential to the way that the state has run Egypt for decades, specifically because this is the largest population in the Arab world. I mean, the population in Egypt now has reached 100 million. In Cairo, the population is 20 million. And we're speaking about a third of the area of the country. So these bodies are all, collected in this particular area, which is the Nile Delta. And so that creates a lot of energy and friction and power. Many people describe what happened in Tahrir as صحوة the giant's awakening, the awakening of the giant. And then when that happened, I think there was panic in the administration because the power of the numbers of people in Egypt is just not controllable. So it is not controllable by physical force. It has to be sort of controlled through other means. And this is a continuous, sort of systemic way of organizing the society in Egypt and also making sure that dissent is controlled. So it wasn't simply biopolitics, it was also necropolitics. Membi describes necropolitics as the determination of who lives and who dies as being essential to sovereignty. And what happened at Tahrir also, the random killings, the random shootings, people were constantly talking about, we didn't know where the bullets were coming from. And the bodies that kept going into the morgues, and the bodies that were carried out of the Tahrir and thrown in dustbins. I'm sure you've seen pictures of that.
Yes, yeah.
Really underscored the disposability of the Egyptian body at that time, but also emphasized the might of the state vis-a-vis this awakened giant. Definitely these two dynamics were happening side by side, fluidly intersecting. It wasn't simply just controlling the population through discursive means, which was happening continuously through media releases by the military junta, through state media, through all kinds of misrepresentations of what was happening, to the point where videos were taken of the events that were altered. So this was an ongoing sort of attack from the state against the uprising, not simply to control, but also to reframe and rehistoricize in ways that undermined the revolutionaries and brought out the state as the sovereign, determinant of life and death, and also the determinant of the future of the country, where stability lies within their hands, and they're the ones who can take over and pull the country through this mass crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was wondering, for those who are listening and are not so familiar with the sort of details of what happened, during the uprisings in Egypt, if you could give some examples of the way that, particularly women resisted through their bodies. Because what you're describing is, of course, biopolitics and body politics, that's a form of resistance, but it's also a form of domination. And so in terms of, women using their bodies to resist the authoritarian state, to signal their protest, both in terms of, the wider body politic, but also more specifically, the 30 or more years of authoritarian corrupt regime, plus, very specific gender-based claims around their bodily rights. Could you sort of share some sort of key moments during the uprisings? And I'm also thinking you have one chapter in which you very beautifully, it's sort of very in-depth, based on very in-depth ethnographic research. You share some of the experiences of women. If you could, speak a little bit about those.
So women's bodies have and you know this very well because you write about this too, women's bodies have always been framed in ways that disempower women. And these kind of discourses, and I was very careful not to fall into that sort of trap of representing women's bodies as always being put upon or being framed as a victim. The victimization of women's bodies has been an ongoing theme, not just in public media, but also in scholarship. You know, the emphasis, there was this huge wave of emphasis on FGM, you know, like female genital mutilation, as this is like the end all problem of women in the Arab and Middle East region. And that took away from the ways in which women were using their bodies in ways that empowered them, that made them center stage, that allowed them to support their families, that created awareness in society. So I was very careful not to fall into the trap of representing women as the victims of the state. And I also want to, you know, sort of caution us in our discussion not to also, you know, sort of predetermine the state as the end all to all the problems, because it's not just the state. We're looking at the intersection of state power. We're looking at patriarchal discourses. We're looking at rising Islamist groups at a time when this was happening. We're also looking at the Council of Wise Men kind of syndrome, you know, where all of these billionaires came together in order to perpetuate the status quo. So neoliberalism is also at stake. So these were all intersecting forces. So it wasn't simply, you know, the state might or this or that, but it was also this intersectional sort of force that undermined, you know, the efforts that were happening in Tahrir and the dreams that people had in Tahrir, and continuously, you know, sort of erase those sort of efforts and dreams and what have you. So when we look at women's bodies as a form of resistance, we also have to take into account that these kind of resistances are not happening against, you know, one source of imposition on them or one source of marginalization. They're multi-pronged. And that's why I'm saying that to women, being in Tahrir meant a whole lot more than it meant for men. Because the marginalization of non-male bodies, and in that I also include all kinds of non-male bodies, it was not simply revolting against state power, it was simply revolting against all of the processes that marginalize these bodies to begin with. So I know I'm going off on a tangent, but I think
it's important. Yes, I agree.
Put down the structure for the argument as well.
No, I absolutely agree. And actually, that brings me to my next point. I have to say, I was quite concerned at some point when, you know, you had these orchestrated forms of gender-based sexual violence against women, you know, where you had men surrounding women and, you know, sexually abusing them. And at the time when I was speaking to friends and colleagues in Egypt, and you know, there was this, you know, strong emphasis on the state, and you know, depending on where you were standing politically, it was, you know, the state, it was the military, it was the Muslim Brotherhood. But you know, when I would say, okay, but what about gender-based sexual violence that's happening at the workplace, you know, that's happening at home, that's happening on an alleyway when you just cross the street? I mean, and all of us, we have experienced this in Egypt, right? And there was this sort of, you know, this strong kind of narrative, no, I mean, we have to focus on this form of sexual gender-based violence. And I found that very problematic. And I know that, you know, lots of people, and I'm not the only one. And so I very much agree with you. And I guess sort of a follow-up question is, so what does your book tell us about gender-based violence, and what is the relationship between political and sexual violence in your view? And also, I mean, it's a separate question, but maybe, you know, follow up, masculinity. But let's maybe park masculinity for a moment, and that's, you know, because I think we need to separate the two. So yeah, but gender-based violence and the relationship between political violence and sexual violence.
So apologies at first, because I did not go into the narratives of the women that I interviewed, but perhaps, we can
yes,
back to that.
yes.
So to me, I don't see that political violence is separate from gender and sexual violence. I think the two are part and parcel of the same process. And that was very clear in what was happening in Tahrir during that time. And this is simply because the underlying system that informs the political, administrative, and institutional systems in the country is informed by classical patriarchy, a patriarchal system that basically draws on favoring males and elders in society. Obviously, this has undergone many transformations and processes, and under neoliberalism has taken many forms. But this is the sort of the underlying, sort of motivation of the way that women's bodies have been treated and framed, and sexual and political violence. So when we talk about patriarchy to the audience who don't know what patriarchy in the Middle East, how it operates through the system of obligations and privileges, like any other hierarchical system. So in Egypt, for example, the idea of what constitutes masculinity, it is, in my view, the idea that the masculine subject is beyond reproach in vis-a-vis their obligations towards their family, vis-a-vis the honor of their women, the prestige that they enjoy in society. In the absence of, political and economic affluence, honor becomes a very important constituent of masculinity. So, I wrote the article of No Longer a Bargain because that was published right after the event, because I could see very clearly that this patriarchal bargain that, of course, the great Denise Candioti had written about was now shifting and modifying and adjusting to what was happening on the ground. Because of neoliberalism and because of the neoliberal transformations in the country, what was happening here is that there was more emphasis on the curtailment of gender and specifically women, so that this masculine phantom that has now become only symbolic, right, can continue to operate as a privileged system. Mm-hmm. So the state, and basically not just the state, but all of the intersecting forces in Tahrir who were vying for control, emphasized this very strongly through women's bodies. So it was the framing of women's bodies, like the case of the girl in the blue bra, for example, and how the debates, the national debates that, occupied people's minds. Why was she wearing a blue bra? And why was she in Tahrir? And who was this woman? And everything that had to do with her body being exposed and her body being pale and her body this and that, but nothing about her political participation, nothing about her goals or objectives or her resistance to patriarchy or to political repression. It was all simply about the sexualization of her body. So this, the reduction of the complexity of discourses around the body, around women's participation, just becomes a tool of the state in order to discredit the masculinity of the male protesters. So when you expose the women as, and I quote one of the generals who was interviewed during that time, that these women were not like your daughters.
Daughters, yes.
Right?
Exactly.
These women were prostitutes, they were having sex in the tents, they were taking drugs, they were doing all XYZ. And of course, the moment these kind of declarations are made by a military figure with such authority, people obviously, people's opinion is affected right away, because it feeds on this, it sort of discourse about what honor is and that these people are not honorable.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
it really did, kind of zero in on these social and cultural values in a way that was almost genius to watch.
Yeah.
I mean, very strategic. ways of doing that.
Yes, and despite that, women did fight back, and of course, one of the big sort of symbols and acts of resistance was Samira Ibrahim, who was certainly not the first one to experience enforced virginity tests, but actually to go public with it and go to court. I mean, that was an amazing act, and I know it was not easy. But before, so I would like to eventually get back to the experiences. I'm also conscious that we have questions, but yes. I can't help but interject. You mentioned, Denise Candioti and the patriarchal bargain. Mm-hmm. I also heard you say, it's not business as usual. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can reflect then on, so, in just to put it in a nutshell, I mean, it's of course a much more complex argument, but in, this argument of the patriarchal bargain, Denise Candioti argued that, most women, won't have the resources and the ability to fight patriarchy. I mean, it takes quite a bit. So in many contexts, what women do is work with the system, try to make the system work for themselves. And that often, of course, results in women working against each other. So the kind of stereotypical, bad mother-in-law is kind of an example of a woman who's using finally her seniority to then, show her power over a younger woman, and then sort of the system reproducing itself. But she herself, was actually saying, well, but that patriarchy as usual does not work anymore. When I look what's happening in Egypt and other countries in the region, and it's not working because patriarchy as we know it, a kind of classical form, has been challenged so much from many different angles. Okay. And so what she was describing then was what she's called masculinist restoration, that in some ways, because patriarchy as we know it does not feel stable and safe anymore, it is trying to assert itself in more violent ways.
Yes, absolutely.
So I was wondering if you found that was a useful way of thinking about the situation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also her subsequent work on the subject has been extremely helpful. I think that when you look at patriarchy in Egypt, in particular, after the IMF structural adjustment policies of the 1990s, patriarchy was transformed. So with the land reform laws, and the parceling out of land and the disintegration of the extended family structure, all of this led to a sort of an undermining of the patriarchal system, specifically in its obligations to take care of extended families, take care of women, take care of older people. I mean, in my older work, when I was working with Islamist women who were trying to Islamically reform villages, one of the main problems that they had were older women in rural areas, mind you, in villages, very tight-knit villages, who were literally left to die from hunger. And that goes completely counter patriarchal systems, where older women who are, getting higher status with age and with, position in society and becoming closer in their status to their male counterparts, are now being left literally to die of hunger. And so that is a complete reversal of the patriarchal bargain, where women, stand to gain when they get older, they are served, they are honored, they are treated with dignity, and so on and so forth. So definitely there is a breakdown in the patriarchal system, and it no longer privileges men the way that it did. And that creates a lot of anger, a lot of violence. And as I argued in my article, the violence then is perpetrated against the weakest link, which is to these men with violent masculinities, is women.
Well, before I'm going to look at the questions, I would like you to just sort of share with us some of the experiences, because I thought that was really you needed to do the kind of research that you did. I mean, you had to really go in there into very in-depth ethnographic research, and also obviously establish a close relationship with the women that you're talking to. And so if you could just share some of the experiences that women, told you about.
So it was really a privilege, and I've mentioned this so many times whenever I discuss the book, that it's always a privilege, when you're doing ethnography, when you're speaking with your interlocutors, you always feel that you are in a space of that's almost sacred, that's almost how can I explain this? It's a feeling of human connection where you actually receive a gift from another human being. And in this particular study, I felt that this was a much bigger gift and a much bigger sacrifice than I could ask from anyone. Because even though at the very beginning of my conversations with the women, they were also excited and so gung-ho, so was I, obviously. So there was so much to tell. There was so much that they were, so invested in telling me. They wanted their names in the book, their real names, which in anthropology, obviously, we should not do, and we never do mention the real names. And I had to go back and change some of them, except for the ones that were in the news. And it was just incredible. It was like euphoria, In the beginning, it felt like this was a new lease on life, that you were seeing the world through a completely different lens. And then as things progressed, this euphoria dissipated, and the conversations became darker and more intense. And there was sadness and there was trauma, until at the very end, it became so difficult actually to have these conversations, not only because many of the women themselves avoided having the conversations. I mean, they would cancel at the last minute. They would not be available for whatever reason. They would close up. But it also became very difficult for me to probe, because how can you probe a wound? You see someone bleeding and you're, in there, trying to probe that. Yeah. So it was really not just, sort of like a one-on-one kind of regular ethnography. This was a very moving, very emotional process, not just for the women that I interviewed, but also for myself. When I was writing this book, I was in tears because I was writing right after the uprising had sort of ended, and I was reading all of these stories, and it's just too much to take against the contrast of what was happening in Egypt.
Yeah.
Some of the stories, my favorite story actually, and I don't make a secret of this, is the story of the twins. And this is the story of Hoda and Niveen, who are both, middle-class women in their 60s, and they come from the same kind of background, and they grew up in the same household, yet each one of them took a completely different path. So needless to say, they come from a very traditional household where the father was, palace walk kind of male who had land and was privileged, and the mother was, this white blonde, sort of Circassian Egyptian who was always trying to please everybody and never had time for herself or her own, sort of subjectivity or her own independence, I suppose. Hoda became a lawyer. She took a path that was more left, and Niveen became an Islamist and joined the Brotherhood and married someone who was in the Brotherhood. And the two of them, I mean, we're not just talking about two sisters, we're talking about twins. And their story and how they ended up meeting in Tahrir Square. And then the feelings, I did not interview Niveen, unfortunately. I only interviewed Hoda, who's the left counterpart of the twins. But it was so revealing of so many things. It was almost like this very tiny microcosm of Egyptian society and how people from very different backgrounds and very different dispositions and political aspirations came together in Tahrir. There was mistrust. Definitely there was not 100% trust, but there was this sort of cautious, newly found respect where people could actually reach out and see that they could commiserate and they could collaborate and they could work together. But there's still all of these suspicions. And whenever you were talking about, whenever things happen, oh, you know, the Brotherhood is blamed, or the state is blamed, or this is, depending on where you are in the political spectrum. So this to me was just a beautiful story. And I'm hoping to explore that at some point when I go to Egypt next.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, and of course, those of you who would like to know more, read the book. I'm now going to look at the question. And Sherine, if it's okay with you, I'm going to read out 3 questions,
okay,
so that you know, we can gather a few. Okay, so the first one is by our colleague and friend Amani Jamal. Hello, Amani. She's saying, great discussion. Looking back, were there things the women's movements should have done differently to ensure that the issues continue to be represented? So the next question is by Maro Youssef. Hi, Sherine. Can you talk more about when the woman in your book said, "You're making me remember"? I'm curious about your thoughts on gender, memory, and transition uprising. Are women being written out of transitions, uprisings? If so, how do they internalize that? Okay, can you take one more question, or?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, so the next question is by Daina Abdelkader. Hi, Sherine. How do you address the popular entertainment industry and the rise in women's harassment on the streets, including the Tahrir presence of women? What I mean is that the uncontrolled entertainment industry and its ridiculous representation of women is directly correlated to women's perception and harassment in public.
Okay, I think I forgot the first one.
You want me to, so this
Yes,
is Amani asking, you know, should women's movements have done things differently to ensure that the issues continue to be represented?
Amani, thank you for the question. And you know, it is actually inspiring me to think about things in a more critical way, but I actually don't think that way. As an anthropologist, I never think in a way that competes with the people that I'm working with or you know, interlocuting with. So for me, the choices that people make and the directions that they take are always of the highest respect. And I don't like to engage in how can I say, judgments about people that I meet in the field. But in terms of the feminist movement, I honestly have the greatest respect for what happened during the uprising. And I think that women were incredibly smart, agile, involved. I mean, I wouldn't have written this book if I didn't think so. The galvanization of women, the mobilization of groups. I mean, the stories I can tell you about the efforts that happened, they're not all in the book because I was focusing obviously on the body and all of this, but there were so many bridging efforts that happened during that time that again were very rarely seen. In terms of what they could have done differently, I think this is the question that we should ask everyone, not just the women's movement, because so many people are responsible for sidelining women, and the effort was happening constantly, and women were fighting back every step of the way. I mean, if you look at the timeline, I put together a gendered timeline of the revolution for that specific purpose, to show how things developed during that time and how women were very quick to respond. The response was just incredible. Like Egypt's women are a red line, for example, that march the way that they organized it, the way that they went out and printed the banners and they put the flags up and they organized, they got all of these, famous feminists to be at the front of the march. It was just incredible, the effort that happened. But I think the question has to be addressed to the larger population. What could Egyptians have done differently to support women in their time of need and to make sure that they were up there when things changed? But with a military government, obviously that is very male-centric, whose ethic and ideology is informed by masculinity, it seems like we keep on repeating those same cyclical issues and challenges that we've always faced in the country. We're looking at a male-centric ideology that basically has no place for women. And so women's job now is to deal with that, to try and sort of address these patriarchal issues. And women are actually doing that on social media platforms. Young women are extremely vocal. My daughter keeps informing me of new, stars on social media and bloggers who are constantly addressing patriarchy and sexuality in ways that were never done before. So perhaps the younger generation now is going to take the helm. And I think that would be an incredible thing to see. For the second question about memory. Maro, thank you for that question. I'm very interested in memory and how memory works. And for me, it was very important to bring these memories back. And like I said, it was like probing an open wound. And so many of the conversations that I've had with women have been painful ones because they address all of these traumatic, experiences that they've had, not just in Tahrir for them personally, but the trauma that they saw. So one of the women that I spoke with, I call her May in the book, and she talked to me about the young children who were in Tahrir, the young so-called street children. And she was trying to tell me that this was the most traumatic thing for her to see when she held one of their hands, in her hand. And there was this tiny hand that had so many wrinkles and calluses on it that it looked like a 70-year-old's hands. And when I saw this young child's hand in mine, I realized, how big the problem that we have to deal with is. And it became for her, the memory of that tiny hand in hers that was so weathered by work and living on the street and dealing with poverty and lack of food and care. She realized that this is a fight that would never end. And that memory, when you see people talk to you about these painful and traumatic things, their bodies are transformed. So memory is not this intellectual process. It's not simply emotional, but it's also corporeal. And that intersection between the emotion, the body, and the moments that are being relived in front of you, again, reminds me of what a great privilege it is to do what we do, to have these interviews, to have these opportunities to speak with people that are so incredibly brave and special, and who will, I hope, one day actually succeed in what they're doing. So for me, remembering and probing that wound was very important because it enabled this book to be written so that people can actually look at it and read it one day and say, yeah, I remember those days. This is what happened. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm simply a conduit. But as anthropologists go, we all know that it's our agenda that drives our work. So as far as that, I did the best I could. And I hope that other people will continue writing about these events so that they are never forgotten.
Sherine, before you go to the next question, I'm wondering, I would like to interject and sort of ask you a follow-up question, because so the issue of memory, especially in the context of traumatic experiences, has been very much key in the context of my work on Iraq and women's memories of, the Ba'ath regime, sanctions, political repression and the various wars and the occupation. And what I was struggling with and has been a kind of methodological challenge, but also kind of political moral challenge, is the non-linear relationship between people's experiences and the way they remember things in light of the presence, and how memory is so much shaped by people's being in the present and also the vision for the future, right? And then that sort of was a challenge for me, to kind of gauge that and to deal with sometimes the friction between the different ones, especially when I knew that some of the memories were so politicized, right?
Of course.
And they are also very much changing as time goes by. And so I guess I was wondering whether that was on your mind as you were listening to women and as you're sort of writing up their stories, but also thinking about all the time that has passed since you did the research and all the things that have happened. Did you have a chance to talk again to some of the women or some other women? Because clearly now, my friends, when they speak about, there's of course still the enthusiasm, but because there is like this mass depression and disillusionment about the political situation in Egypt, there's also a lot of sort of reflecting and rethinking of what happened then. I don't know if that's too early for you, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So in terms of the tensions between the present and the politicization of memory, I should also throw in history, because history also informs the way that memory is relayed and understood.
Yes.
So I guess for me, the resolution of that and being, informed by post-structuralist theory and postmodernism is that I see all of these as very fluid energies. So the past, the present, politics, I guess to me, what those memories that I collected were, they were only temporal. So at that particular moment, when I was speaking with this particular person, this is what they said. This is how they remembered. This is how their bodies responded. So I was very careful to always situate the conversations. So they were not, sort of like ephemeral or anachronistic, but specific to the moment in which we have spoken, in the place in which we have spoken. So that's one thing. And then what was the second part of the question?
Well, if you had a chance to speak to women now.
Yes, I have many times, and we have stayed in contact over Facebook. Obviously, there's a lot of trauma, but there's also a lot of silence. And so people are very wary about speaking about the revolution. And as you know, of course, there has been a lot of whitewashing, or I don't know how to maybe describe it. It could be rose washing. Considering I think the symbol of this is what happened in Tahrir Square, and right now, the glitzification of a place that has always signified the nation and its people has now become almost like a 5-star hotel.
Would you like to say a few words in relation to the question about the popular entertainment industry and its ridiculous representation of women?
This is an ongoing problem. This is something that happens everywhere, and I'm not a media expert, but obviously we've all, anybody who works on gender in the Middle East and the Arab world is always dealing with issues of representation. I believe that you cannot be working in this area of specialization without always coming up against issues of representations. Be they local issues or Western issues or what have you. it's a constant uphill battle. And I think in my teaching, it's also central to almost every class I teach. We always start from the premise of representation. How can we work against representation? How can we be critical of representation? So obviously, we're also up against an industry that makes money, huge amounts of money, off of misrepresenting women and objectifying them. So it's not simply a political issue, it's also an economic issue where people make money off of these representations. But I also, like I mentioned, the idea that women are now speaking on social media platforms. They are creating virtual groups. They are discussing salient projects that are relevant to them and to their lives today. I think there is always an energy that counteracts and debunks the oppressive energies. So it's not always this one-sided negative picture where women are constantly being put upon by the media, but women are also speaking up and trying to reframe the terms of the debate.
Yeah. I'm conscious that we're running out of time. I'm going to quickly read out a couple of questions and then give you a minute, to say what you'd like to say in conclusion, Sherine. So Laura Beer is saying, could you speak about some of the organizations like Operation Anti-Harassment and Tahrir Bodyguard, whose mission was to patrol the square to protect female demonstrators? Do you see anything new and novel in such organizations, or do you see continuities with other previous activism or patriarchal rhetorics of female protection? And our colleague, also another colleague, Katharina Sama, is asking, or Catherine Sama, Nadia's comment and your work make me think about how we define political successes and failures. In light of upticks and setbacks in the MENA region, how does an exploration of women's activism in these movements and upsurges help us reconfigure the realm of the political? And that's, of course, a big question. You have 2 minutes.
I don't know if I can do these justice. Yes, quickly, no. I did not focus on sexual harassment in the book. I did engage with some activists who worked on sexual harassment issues, but I was more concerned with women's, sort of political use of their bodies. And I didn't want to give sexual harassment like my focus because, like I said, I did not want to frame the body in ways that were simply, sort of disempowering. I have many colleagues, and I can cite many colleagues who have worked on sexual harassment issues who have done a fantastic job trying to deal with, the changing ideologies of many of these activist groups. And obviously, you know who they are, Laura. So in that regard, I still feel that there's a lot to be done. And unfortunately, sexual harassment will continue happening despite the new laws, because we all know that, putting these laws down is not going to change anything as long as people think a particular way and practice sexual harassment a particular way. In terms of Catherine's question, Catherine, obviously this is a much bigger question that I would love to have a conversation about maybe at some other point, but for the time being, I think it's a little of both. I think we're constantly trying to navigate and negotiate and work with negative impacts and failures and successes. It's a little bit of both. There's never really truly a successful revolution. As we have seen in history, a revolution continues evolving. That's the whole premise of the term revolution, that there are always, these revolutions, they revolve, so there are times when certain things are going to be successful and other things are going to be on the back burner, and then it keeps revolving again, and we will see new and interesting changes in the Middle East. This is not the end of it. And as we all know, as we write these books, as we write these articles, things are already changing and becoming, and some of the things that we write become obsolete. But we still do them because we want to be engaged with what's happening. But it's always important to keep in mind that change is always happening. That's for sure. That's the only thing that we can predict.
Yeah, I very much agree, Sherine. And well, thanks so much. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. and learned a lot. And thanks to all of you who've been listening in on different channels. And obviously we also make the recording available. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you so much for your questions and for hosting me today. This was such